Welcome everyone to Shared Legacies. In order to best view the program, we encourage you to put your screen on speaker view. If you are watching on a computer, in the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom, you will see the word view. On an iPad, it is on the upper left corner. Please click on speaker view so that you can fully appreciate the program. Thank you to everyone of every faith and every community who is joining us today. This Shared Legacies program is a special Stamford, Connecticut program for Black History Month. It is also unique as it is an important discussion about Black-Jewish relations and the civil rights movement. We'll be talking about it both from a historical point of view, but also looking at today and towards the future. We hope you had a chance to watch the film Shared Legacies, the African American Jewish Civil Rights Alliance. If you did not, you can still watch it until tomorrow night. You received a link to watch it for free with your confirmation for tonight's discussion, and we will send it out again. I want to thank Reverend Dr. Michael Christie from Union Baptist Church, who really pushed us all to make this event happen. From AJC Westchester Fairfield, my name is Myra Clark-Siegel, and I am the Regional Director for AJC. Jill Friedman and our President, Stephanie Barrand. From the JCC, thank you to Nancy Schiffman. From Rose of Sharon Ministries, Bishop Hinton. And from Temple Bethel, Rabbi Hammerman and Julie Rosenberg. This collaboration and the partnership of so many organizations and houses of worship speak to the importance we all place on our partnership together. We also want to thank Susan Sabrine and Peter Ringer for their help and collaboration on the video segments. And thank you to Shari Rogers for creating this extraordinary film that has given us the opportunity to come together in conversation with one another. After our panel concludes, we will have a few minutes for audience questions. If you have a question, please write it in the chat directed to questions. We will try to accommodate as many questions as possible. First, we will begin with key messages just for tonight from U.S. Representative Jim Hyman and State Representative Matt Blumenthal.
Hi, I'm Congressman Jim Hyman, and I'm just thrilled to join all of you at this Shared Legacies Black History Month celebration. I think what we're here to talk about today could not be more important. And that's obviously a celebration of Black History Month, but also an acknowledgement and a celebration of the remarkable partnership that so changed our country. And that's the partnership between, particularly during the Civil Rights Movement, the partnership between Black Americans and Jewish Americans. I was too young to have participated in the marches or in the Freedom Summer, but when you look at all that happened in the 1960s, when this country took such steps forward in terms of delivering on the promise of rights for all, it was all Americans who came together in the South, but in particular, it was Jewish Americans and Black Americans who marched side by side, who organized, who ran voting sign-up stations throughout the South. And of course, tragically, in an event that galvanized the civil rights movement in June of 1964, two Jewish boys from New York, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwimmer, died side by side with James Chaney, a Black American from Mississippi, in what was an outrageous and brutal murder by white supremacists and Ku Klux Klan in the state of Mississippi. And so it is a moment for celebration, but also for remembering the remarkable sacrifices that people of the Jewish faith and that Black Americans made. And my sense is that the partnership there was a partnership born of generations, if not centuries, of dispossession, of vulnerability, of not having the rights that, at least in this country, should be guaranteed to every American. So, as I said, it's a remarkable thing to make sure that we don't forget that the civil rights movement was a huge step forward for Black Americans. Not a big enough step forward. We still have so much work to do, which is why we need to remember that in the 1960s, we really came together, and in particular, Jewish Americans and Black Americans came together to make real progress. I was in the Capitol on January 6th, and I saw some of the people who came to do violence to Democratic and Republican leaders alike. And the hate that I saw in some of the eyes of the people that came to the Capitol on January 6th was a hatred that maybe you might have thought we left behind in the 1950s, but it has not been left behind. Prejudice, bigotry, anti-Semitism may have even gotten a little bit more life recently. And so we need to redouble our efforts and remember those partnerships so that regardless of our religion, regardless of our skin color, we remember that, in the words of Martin Luther King, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And we address that injustice by coming together in the kinds of partnerships that we celebrate today. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this celebration.
Hi, I'm Matt Blumenthal, State Representative for Stamford and Darien, and a proud congregant of Temple Bethel, Stamford. I'm so honored and grateful to have the opportunity to participate in today's event in celebration of Black History Month. Throughout our histories in this country, Black and Jewish Americans have shared an uncommonly close partnership. This has been especially true during the civil rights struggle that started in the 20th century and continues through the present. From Abraham Joshua Heschel marching with Dr. King, to the 17 rabbis arrested at the protest at the Monson Motor Lodge, to the martyrdom of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner in Mississippi, to today's Black Lives Matter protests. Many Jews have stood alongside Black Americans in their struggle for equality and justice in America. That's not to say that the relationship has always been perfect. No relationship is. But the relationship between our communities has been an important one and a strong one. It's been strong not only because of our shared spiritual teachings, but also, I believe, because we, Jews with our own history and experience of persecution, can identify particularly with the oppressed in their struggle for liberation and have a special understanding of the philosophy expressed most eloquently by Dr. King, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Today, the partnership between our communities is more important than ever. With anti-Semitism, white supremacy, and violent extremism on the rise in America and around the world, we must stand shoulder to shoulder against bigotry, hate, and injustice. We must continue the fight to ensure that Black Americans can enjoy the full promise of America, a promise that has never yet been fully realized. And we must continue to fight to ensure that all Americans can live freely and fully without fear. Thank you for all your work in that fight.
Thank you to Representative Hymes and to Representative Matt Blumenthal. Before we introduce our esteemed panelists, we will first hear from Mother Blanche Sumter, who will speak of her memories of what life was like before the Civil Rights Movement.
I was born and raised in South Carolina, which is Beaufort County, and I'm a part of the segregated South. And I have had great experience about that because when went to school and you graduated, the only thing you could do, you would be, any job you could get was a teacher, because that way you could teach in the Black school naturally. So that was the only job you could do. And other than that, you would do work in private family And that was it. Or you work at a factory, the crab factory, which we do with the crabs, and the oyster factory, or the farm, the trucking farm. So that was the job for us, because you could not go work in the five and dime or the pharmacy. Of course not. And I could remember going into the pharmacy, what they call the drugstore. You can go in and get an ice cream cone, and you go and come back out. You pay for it. You could not sit at the counter. So I mean, that was a no-no. The theater, we had to go upstairs. You went around the back of the building, and you go upstairs in the balcony, and that was it. If you want to go to a restaurant, you go around the back at the window. If you devise a sandwich, that's how you went. You got your hot dog and your hamburger if you chose to do that. So those were the days, and I left my hometown at an early age, because for whatever reason I didn't like that. If you walk down the street and a group of white people walking on the sidewalk, I should say, and it was naturally just for meanness, they would spread over the whole sidewalk, and therefore you, as a black person, you step on the street until you pass them, then you can go back up on the sidewalk. So it was a lot that we had to bear, but we did it, and we knew enough to stay in our place. When I was real young down in South Carolina, our parents would just keep us close in the house, especially at night, because the night riders, they used to call them, the clans, used to come through on horseback. And if they see any kids, or it didn't matter, they'd pick them up and kidnap them. So that was something to worry about. And those were just trying times, but we have overcome because we have our faith. We were Christian. We had God to rely on. So that's what carried us through.
Good afternoon. My name is Nancy Schiffman, and I'm the Associate Executive Director of Development and Signature Programs at the Stamford JCC. The Jewish Film Festival of Fairfield County and the JCC Social Action Committee is thrilled to be a partner today in this community celebration of Black History Month, focusing on the powerful alliance between African Americans and Jewish Americans. It's an absolute honor to introduce you to our distinguished panelists for today's discussion. Due to their extensive accomplishments and credentials, and in our interest of spending the bulk of our time together in meaningful dialogue, I'd like to keep the introductions brief. It's a pleasure to have joining us today Reverend Dr. Michael Christie from Union Baptist Church in Stamford, Rabbi Joshua Hammerman from Temple Bethel in Stamford, Reverend Michael Hyman, advisor for the Equity Institute at Domus and co-chair of Stamford Stands Against Racism, and Dr. Shari Rogers, director and producer of the film Shared Legacies, the African American Jewish Civil Rights Alliance. And our moderator today will be Reverend Dr. Stephen Pogue, vice chair of Westchester Human Rights Commission and pastor at the Greater Centennial Church in Mount Vernon, New York. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us in this great conversation, in this important conversation. I want to start by asking Shari Rogers a question. The movie you made was such an important one, and we thank you for making that movie. My question to you is, what led you, or what made you choose to make that movie, and what was the one most important thing you learned along the way?
Thank you so much. I'm always so honored to be with this esteemed panel, and the woman that just spoke. Every story is so important. We all have something to contribute, no matter what degree, no matter how much movies, every historical story is so important. So I thank you for that important story. what inspired me to make this movie? Well, I'm from Michigan, and we have an amazing museum here in Detroit. It's called the Charles Wright Museum, a terrific museum. And I go to a lot of lectures, and I happened to be at a lecture where a Stanford professor was speaking. His name is Dr. Clarence B. Jones. If you watch the film, he is the person in the film who says, if the lions don't tell their stories, the hunters will get all the credit. So he had just written a book, What Would Martin Say? And he was chosen by Claiborne Carson at Stanford University after Coretta Scott King gave Claiborne Carson Dr. King's papers to create a Martin Luther King Institute. He was chosen by Claiborne Carson to be the inside thinker of Dr. King's mind, because not only was he his attorney, but he was his draft speechwriter, his legal advisor. And he had written a book, What Would Martin Say? And in this book, one of the chapters that he highlighted at the museum when I was at the lecture was a chapter on anti-Semitism and how the Jewish people were a part of the civil rights movement. And then specifically, he talked about how Dr. Martin Luther King had specifically asked him to remind the people. He said, at the time, he said, Clarence, I know you will be the one to remind our brothers of the 24/7 commitment of the Jewish people to our struggle. And I think Dr. Jones always told me that Dr. King knew his life was targeted. He knew that any day he could be killed. And so it's amazing, not only do we all know that he was a prophet, he had certain roles for different people. So this was one of the main reasons, is having somebody 1 degree separated from Dr. King. And he already was talking about this importance of reminding people of this coalition, that's what motivated me.
And what was the one most important thing you learned along the way?
I think the most important thing that I learned was that the coalition was really steep. And while we speak about Rabbi Heschel and Dr. Martin Luther King as the symbol, if you will, because it was a biblical movement, that it was so steep on all different levels, whether it was lawyers, students, and for all different reasons. But it was the intimate relationships that really struck me. So for instance, Rabbi Sugarman, who I couldn't put in all the stories. As you know, we're building a whole curriculum because we have 100 hours that we didn't use. There's so much to tell on this history. This is just the beginning of unraveling. But Rabbi Sugarman, for instance, was very close to Hosea Williams, who was one of the civil rights workers. It's all these, people were boots on the ground that you can't put in this film. You can't show all these boots on the ground. Well, Rabbi Sugarman, who was the rabbi after Rabbi Rothschild at the temple that you see in the film that was bombed, on his deathbed, he is sitting with Reverend Jesse Jackson. Rabbi Sugarman is holding his hand, praying over Hosea Williams. It's these intimate stories, one after the other, that gave me the chills up my arm, because the intimate stories were so deep that they sort of spark your soul. So that's what really got to me.
Thank you for that. And as you can tell from Shari's description of this film, it was a powerful film, and we hope that all of you watched it. And those of you who have not had a chance to watch the film, at this moment we're going to show you the trailer to this extraordinary film, Shared Legacies.
There's an African proverb that says if the lions don't tell their stories, the hunters will get all the credit.
I'm telling you the story now because you're young lions and lionesses.
My great-grandfather had been in slavery, and it goes across generations. You just don't get rid of it simply because there are no chains on you.
The effects of slavery are still very prominent, just as the effects of the Holocaust are still very prominent amongst our brothers and sisters in the Jewish community.
The Jewish people have the DNA in their soul to look up close to what happened to African Americans after slavery.
We came to the South, young Jews, rabbis, many of them refugees from Nazi Germany. We hear Dr. King quoting the prophets. That was extraordinary. It made us proud.
Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel said, "The future of America will depend on how it responds to Dr. King."
It was the work that Dr. King had spoken for, fairness, equality, against anti-Semitism, and sort of freedom for Soviet Jews.
A large Jewish presence in the civil rights movement was evident almost from the beginning.
Well, Stan Levinson and Harry Wachtel were lawyers who were working with Dr. King. They were advisors, marchers, fundraisers. They were in the thick of things.
Many Jewish students worked all across the South. And I will never, ever forget 3 young men, Andy Goodman, Micah Scherner, and James Shaney.
Birmingham is Birmingham.
We all know the Exodus is the central narrative of our redemption. And here is a modern situation. Shall we do nothing?
We could not have gotten anywhere had not Protestants, Catholics, and Jews showed up from all over the world.
Rabbi Joachim Prinz spoke immediately before Dr. King.
The most shameful and the most tragic problem is silence.
The civil rights challenges of our time, the human rights challenges of our day, they hang on me. They hang on you. They hang on who? They hang on us.
We all need to get together to find out the bigger picture. Those who have been stepped upon have to lead the way.
It's all about our humanity. And if we don't figure out a way truly to work together, we'll just be like hamsters on a wheel. The systemic oppression and issues will just continue.
There are too many people living in fear. If Rabbi Herscher and Martin Luther King Jr. were here today, I think they would be saying, we need to pull together for the generation yet unborn.
The soul of America is at stake.
As you can see, this is a powerful movie. And if you have not watched it, we hope that you would use the link that you have been given and watch the movie. This is a question and to all of our panelists. Even though slavery had ended about 100 years before, the suffering of Black population had certainly not ended. This trailer pointed out the histories of the Jewish and Black communities. Reverend Jesse Jackson and the late Representative John Lewis, may we always remember his memory. Talk about the rabbis and the young Jewish students who came south to help the 3 who were murdered by the Klan. Reverend Christie, I'll start with you. Can you talk about the role that history, the Bible, and religious beliefs spoke to both communities, and then how is it still important now? And can you also talk a little bit about the importance of being active participants in the movement for change? And what are some of the examples that you can give of being active participants today?
Thank you, Dr. Pogue. Well, as the film shared, that we have a story, and the Exodus story, both in the Hebrew text, is one that is valued, and often Black preachers was used, especially during the early civil rights era. Coming from slavery, just as Jewish people were enslaved in Egypt, making our Exodus, trying to find the promised land, and in some way we're still on the journey trying to find the promised land, but we're not in the same metal chains, maybe chains in a different way. And so we share that shared reality together, that we share spirituality of the same divinity, of a God that is against oppression, is a God that desired to have his people free. And it's a beautiful combination and a beautiful intersection between the Jewish community and the Black community, because I think that story, that Exodus story, lent, and I was really just touched by Rabbi Heschel story that he, a product of the Holocaust, and he was just so in touch with the fact that you can't be silent. There's no way the Jewish people can sit, watch blacks be treated the way they were treated, just as Jews were treated the same way, and good Americans stood silently and watched. So that's where I think we kind of intersect, and I mourn the fact that we've kind of lost some of that today, that connection and that shared reality. And your second question was, remind me again.
Can you also talk about the importance of being active participants in change today? And what are some of the examples of being actively participating today?
Yeah, so if you're speaking of the change in terms of our collaboration with the Black and Jewish Alliance, is that the change you're referring to?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're doing that now. I mean, Rabbi Hammerman and myself, Union Baptist Church and Temple Bethel and others have kind of come together to try to make not just talk theory and not just talk out of our words, but to actually put our words into action. And we've done several collaborations, several things together, sharing in our services together and different things. We had a food drive back in December where we went and brought food to the community, and many of Temple Bethel's members were there with us, handing out boxes and coordinated and sharing food to those that were in need. So those are some of the real, at least in the context of COVID where we're restricted, those are some of the places we can do it in a safe way, join together and make a difference. And the possibilities are endless about how we can join hands together and really contribute to the community and repair our relationship between Black and Jews.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Christie. Rabbi Hammerman, how about you?
Well, I'd first of all like to endorse what Dr. Christie just said. We've done some tremendous things, and Julie Rosenberg is on this Zoom, and she's been planning it between the two congregations. I'm really, really proud of our congregants, of both congregations, for taking those first steps. But anyway, I believe it or not, I was not old enough to be involved in the 60s. I'm actually sort of glad to say that in a way. But for so much of my career, I've looked back with envy at some of the people we'll be hearing from, we've been hearing from, and we saw in the movie, and Shari, thank you so much for that movie, who were able to take a step at a crucial moment in history to change history. Well, this is one of those be careful what you wish for moments, because I think right now, there is nothing more important that we could be doing than strengthening this relationship. Right now is the 60s, right now. And I don't believe it's happened since then. I think from 1970 until just about 2016 or so, this wasn't happening. I mean, of course, there were horrible things happening, but this moment wasn't happening. We had then Birmingham Church and the temple bombing in Atlanta. Now we have Pittsburgh and Charleston and Charlottesville. We have this great confluence of pain and a great convergence of common interest. And the pain could not be more extreme. And the realities that the pain we thought we had left behind, we haven't really left behind. So for the African-American community, there is 1619. And for the Jewish community, there is 1933 to 1945. We have experienced and witnessed the greatest evils our civilization has ever known, and we're still seeing it. Maybe perhaps not exactly in the same way, but we are still seeing it. So we can come together. This is a moment for us to come together in common interest. And, we have 1619, we have 1933, but we also have Exodus 12. And what we share, and we've been doing a lot of biblical study together, going back to Genesis, the curse of Ham, etc. But it's the Exodus story that you see throughout the 60s and you see happening again and again and again, because it's that story. And we're going to have a Freedom Seder actually next month with our congregations. We experience in the Exodus story extreme otherness. We experience this unquenchable drive for justice that inspires us, and the understanding that justice means justice for all, or it'll be justice for nobody. And the indomitable human spirit that enables us to overcome the darkness and never lose hope and never lose the capacity to love our neighbor. We get all of that the two communities, especially because of our personal experience of the Exodus. And so I think we can take these biblical lessons. This is fundamentally as was mentioned, a religious movement. And it's a religious movement that we share and that we can bring as examples, as witnesses to evil, and as survivors, we can bring to the country at a crucial moment for democracy and for America.
Thank you for that. Reverend Hyman, why don't you chime in?
With pleasure. The ideas that have been presented by Rabbi Hammerman and Reverend Christie I would certainly agree with. We look at a 20-year period of time. This is the year 2021, and all of us can remember, like yesterday, the year 2000, for example. Well, there are opportunities that occurred in this country. There are certain things that happened just at the right time, and people accepted those opportunities and used them for the betterment of our country. In 1963, 1964, that was a period of time where there were people who walked in the US, who were here and who were alive, who had been in concentration camps, who knew firsthand that particular story and could actually empathize with Black Americans and where we stood at this time. So the idea of people being able to commiserate, to understand one another, to feel empathy for one another. Many of those people who came to this country after the Great War, World War II, have been liberated in some instances by Black soldiers who did not have freedom in this very nation. So think of that closing of the circle of people coming to this country and realizing that there is something wrong that has happened or is happening in this country, and that they could not be silent. They could not help but, as Rabbi Hammerman said, the convergence of these two things coming at the same time, of these two people. And the intimacy that has been spoken of, I think is one of those things that the moment and taking the opportunity. In the Black Baptist churches, we talk often about waiting on the Lord, but we also talk about being prepared so that when that moment does come, you have not simply sat around waiting and become lethargic, but that you're ready to seize it. And I think that Dr. King and others grabbed ferociously to those who offered help. And that help was right on time, actually. So.
Thank you for that. Shari, what do you have to add to that question?
Which one, about today?
About today, yes.
Well, first of all, the twin win in Georgia. Not only did Senators Ossoff and Warnock just win, the first Jew out of Georgia and the first Black out of Georgia, but this is Senator Warnock is Dr. King's, represents his church. Mm-hmm. Okay, and even at a deeper level, on CNN, Senator Warnock could have just, was excited about his win, but what did he do? He lifted up the entire history by saying Rabbi Joshua Heschel and Dr. Martin Luther King would be shining down on the win. So that's powerful. That's powerful that he understood that he was sitting on the laurels, if you will, of that history. He understood the power of the history, but not to, but he used that history to empower him and Senator Ossoff. But at the same time, he understood that we have a long way to go. But it's just amazing to me. So with all the negativity that's going on in the country, the fact that they were able to raise this history up symbolically is amazing. So I think it gives us all hope to say, especially these are our biblical leaders who are saying this history is something we got to go back and delve into. What connected us before? Let's look at when Rabbi Heschel and Dr. King met in 1963. What was the conversation about? We have to, hopefully this movie just lights a fire. It's just the beginning. It's just the first pebble There's so much to unravel. I mean, how about Mayor Bradley in California? So even when that connection was dissipating, it was the first Black mayor in California. The Jewish people were behind Mayor Bradley. This coalition politically has been very, very powerful. And whether you're, Democrat or Republican, it's not the issue as much as we have to look at all the different coalitions, how we came together in all different levels for the right for Black Americans to be seen as having equal value, and that the Jewish People's Foundation understands that the Exodus story is about Moses being the first social justice protester, if you will, and that the Purim story is coming up, and basically they were saying Jewish people had no value. So we understand what it's like when over and over again they're saying Jewish people don't have value. Well, if we can't stand with the Black community that says, in the 60s, the sign was up, I am a man. What does that mean? That they had to have a sign, I am a man? And today, what is the sign? Black Lives Matter. Yes, they do. And we need to stand with Black Lives Matter. Okay? So the idea is that we understand that every single person has to have value, and that communities have to have value. So if we don't get it, this is our foundation. Sorry, I'm passionate about it. I didn't mean to be so passionate.
Your passion is absolutely contagious to all of us, and you are absolutely right. We all need to come together, especially when we think about the early civil rights efforts at lunch counters and the efforts to register the people to vote, and they were met with violence and incarceration. And in 1963, Martin Luther King, Dr. King, took that movement to the national stage by proposing the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. You saw that in the trailer, how that became, and how Dr. King's I Had a Dream speech still rings so loud today. And some of that dream still has not been realized today. So we have to continue to do it. You also heard Rabbi Prince, who spoke right before Dr. King, who survived the Holocaust. And he said the most shameful and tragic problem is silence. Now, Reverend Hyman, I heard you talk about silence in your answer to the last questions. So can you answer for us today that, it's easy to point the finger about who should do what, who shouldn't do what, but how should we look inward, and how should we understand what it means to be silent today?
To be silent is to betray all that we mean morally to one another, our religion. It is against our faith, really, to be silent when my brother has none or is being oppressed. To be silent is worse, I would even think, than those who actually pick up and take the charge to do harm, because the silence means that you know that there is a problem and that you must deal with it, but you are afraid to do something about it. We know that those young people who went on those bus rides into the South, those individuals who marched, those young children who marched all over the South, in Birmingham and in other places, that they were afraid, but they were emboldened by the fact that they had justice on their hearts and freedom in their minds. Can we do no less than that? Silence is a betrayal for each and every one of us. If my neighbor is being set upon and I do nothing, then I am just as wrong as a person who has done this to me. And so that for us to speak up now and to speak up, Shari has mentioned the idea of Black Lives Matter. And several of us, in speaking with Reverend Christie on another occasion, we mentioned the idea that people will say, well, save the whales. And if we save the whales, it does not mean that it's okay for us to kill the seals. That those of us who are in favor of saving the whales are concerned about all of nature, for example. And so when we say save Black lives or Black Lives Matter, we're talking about the efficacy, the validity, the right for Black people to live. Everyone should be able to support that. But others in this country are not being set upon in that same way. As Jews, we know that the atrocities that have happened in this country for over 100 years, that they have been just as awful. The lynchings of Leo Frank outside of Atlanta in the early 1900s was a horrible thing. But this happened partially because of jealousy and partially because of religious bigotry against that person. Those types of histories don't go away. They reside with us forever. And so that speaking up makes all of the difference in the world. We've spoken up here in America with the elections in Georgia. We've spoken up again with people standing up and saying, not again. We will not allow these things to happen, and we will remain active. That's important for us to do. And I think that all of us will continue, or many of us will continue to do it, because we're inspired by the history that is a part of our country. It's built into our DNA not to give up. And I know that we will not.
Thank you for that. Rabbi Hammerman, I'm gonna go to you. What do you think made the March on Washington so important and successful? And then I want you to talk about the importance of, or what it means to be silent today.
Sure. You know, but just watching the film, I was so impressed with the courage of these rabbis, you know, all of whom have congregations back home who were very similar to congregations all across the board of other faiths back here, back across the country. And I'm sure it was not easy for them to explain to their congregants, you know, I'm going to go get arrested. I've never done this before, but I'm going to go to get arrested and possibly harmed. Rabbi Rothschild in Atlanta, an extremely underrated person in Jewish history. I mean, he is someone we should be studying about in our history books for his courage to stand up. When Dr. King was given the Nobel Prize and no one in Atlanta would honor him. I mean, just imagine the world where that is possible. And Rabbi Rothschild and others stood up. So they are role models. Elie Wiesel said that the opposite of good is not evil, it is indifference. We need to make good trouble again and again and again. And I often, you know, tell my congregants that's what I need to be doing. I don't always agree, but it's important to have that dialogue. So speaking of dialogue, the March on Washington was so unique in that it brought people from all walks of life, a tremendously diverse throng together for a cause. And, you know, that happened again and again in the 60s, although it started to evolve into smaller, more homogeneous groups. The marches against the war tended to be younger demographics, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea of marching was very important. Peaceful protest stood the test of time. And for Jews, everyone sort of went into their own corners. And I have to say, for Jews, it was very important to do so. Inspired by the March on Washington, perhaps the most underrated protest movement of the late 20th century was the protest to save Soviet Jewry. And that movement to save Soviet Jewry was primarily Jewish. If you went to one of the marches, and I went to a few of them, most of the people there were people I would know or people from my demographic. But it was still important to do, and it was inspired again by the March on Washington. But more and more, as you go through the years, you see these marches happening for very small, particularistic groups, for their own liberation, and not for everyone's. That began to change, again, only in the last few years. We saw it with the Women's March, and it was with a struggle to bring in diverse groups. We saw it with the March for Our Lives, for gun violence. We saw it with the climate march, and especially now with Black Lives Matter. You could go to some of the marches in New York and in Washington, and you wouldn't necessarily know that any one particular demographic group was planning it and organizing it. It was a coalescing, a grassroots coalition of the many. We need to be able to reach out and do that once again. It happened in the 60s. It really hasn't happened since, but it's happening now. And it starts with the Jewish and Black communities, I believe.
Thank you for that wonderful answer. Shari, we're going to go to you. Why do you think the March on Washington was so important?
Well, first of all, it was important, just as the rabbi was saying, because it was a coalition of conscience, of people of goodwill coming together. But there was a strategy involved. I mean, what I didn't get into in the film that I touched upon slightly is, you know, that Dr. King, that the ministers and everybody had a strategy. How would this get laid out? And they had the celebrity delegation at the front. They knew that even back then, they knew the power of celebrity to raise the consciousness of the world. And they didn't have social media there. Can you imagine that this speech that was given really is probably, besides the Lincoln address, this might be the most well-known speech, and there was no social media. So at the deepest level, I think Dr. King touched, you know, he woke up the soul of the world. And I think we recognized, I think every human being, when they're born, recognizes that if we're made in the image of God, we all have value, all of us. So I think by him pulling that together in that speech, and by bringing that everybody should be holding hands, it just made perfect sense. It just makes sense to us because it's true that every human being should have value and we should all be pulling together. So I think the power of that, of the Washington March was the coalition of people of goodwill coming together and saying enough is enough. And I think what was amazing that I did show in the film is that Rabbi Prince, who was trying to warn people about Hitler, was the speaker before Dr. Martin Luther King. So, you know, I kind of interwove the Holocaust throughout this film, if you will, because it was only 30 years before the Civil Rights Movement. And so we sort of forget how that impacted, you know, it was seared into the Jewish mind of what it was like to have the people burned just because they were Jewish. And not just the Jewish people, Dr. King understood it. So when he was in the Birmingham jail, for instance, when he had everything else in his mind, he also understood that he would have broken those legal laws in Nazi Germany for his Jewish brothers. And I think that's the power of Dr. King, so much so. I just want to even read this, and this is kind of diverting, but Dr. King calls himself as an extremist. He said, was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despise you and persecute you. Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Let justice roll down like the waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. So why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing this up because he understood that even in his enemies, they had God in them, that he had to stick with them because he had faith in humanity. He had faith when he could have filled his cup up with despair. And why am I saying that now? Because we could all be in despair. If he could have had faith then, with people being treated so horribly, who are we not to have faith now and be hopeful for our future and pull together in a loving way if he could do it? So I don't know if I answered.
Well, thank you so very much. I think you answered it just powerfully as we think about the importance of the March on Washington, as we think about the importance of not being silent. Dr. King talks about it. In the end, we will not remember the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And so as we come together and we come to this important time together and share legacies, it is so important that we are not silenced. Whether it is a Black issue or a Jewish issue, whatever the issue is, we cannot remain silent. And so at this time, we're going to hear from Bishop Hilton.
The efforts to register Black voters in the South had been thwarted, and civil rights leaders planned a march from Selma to Montgomery, the capital of Alabama, to highlight the problem. The first attempt, led by John Lewis on March 7, 1965, ended horrifically, and that day became known as Bloody Sunday. The peaceful marchers were savagely attacked by Alabama state troops as they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge. We will send a short link of Representative John Lewis talking about Bloody Sunday after tonight's event. The second attempt, led by Martin Luther King, 2 days later was stopped too. Finally, 2 weeks later, under the protection of the federalized National Guard's troops, the 54-mile, 5-day march from Selma to Montgomery went forward. It was led by Martin Luther King, John Lewis, Rabbi Heschel, and other civil rights leaders. Rabbi Philip Schechter, who is from Stamford now, flew down from Atlantic City to join the march. Here is his story.
It's a real honor to share with you my memory of the Great March from Selma to Montgomery. Way back in 1965, when I was a young rabbi in Atlantic City, New Jersey, BC, by the way, before casinos, I was deeply involved in the local civil rights movement. Reverend Jack Bailey, a Black Baptist minister, and I co-chaired the Atlantic City Human Rights Forum, where we worked together, trying to get the mayor and the city leadership to appoint a human rights council, now a norm established in cities and towns across New Jersey. I was also a vice president of the local chapter of the NAACP and a delegate from Atlantic City to the NAACP National Convention in Denver. One night in March of 1965, I watched on TV the news of the Civil Rights March from Selma to Montgomery. As the marchers tried to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, I watched with horror the brutal police attack with hoses, tear gas, batons, and police dogs. I knew people, rabbi friends of mine, who were on that march. The next day, the Atlantic City Press, our local paper, reported details of the march, but also printed a significant advertisement announcing a charter flight from nearby Philadelphia Airport to Montgomery, Alabama. I immediately signed up and flew with a plane load of others to join the march for its climax at the state capitol in Montgomery. When we landed, there were chartered buses waiting for us at the airport, and we were taken to the City of Jude, a 36-acre Catholic high school, hospital, and church. The Reverend Martin Luther King was born there, as were most of his family. We joined the estimated 25,000 people who marched from St. Jude to the Capitol in downtown Montgomery. Every so often, we could see National Guard troops and FBI agents guarding the route, activated by President Lyndon Johnson, as murders of marchers had already been reported. The mood was joyous, though serious, and it didn't take too long before I could find rabbi friends I knew, and even a childhood friend from the Bronx. There were Alabama state troopers visibly standing in front of the Capitol building. Presumably, Governor George Wallace, the ardent segregationist, was inside, and we had a petition for him. Dr. King gave us his message called "How Long? Not Long." And Congress acted. And on August 6th, I was invited to the White House to watch President Lyndon Johnson sign the Voting Rights Act, incidentally a bipartisan bill passed by Congress. Also in attendance that day were Dr. King, Rosa Parks, and John Lewis. I will never forget it all.
What a powerful, powerful memory from Rabbi Schechter, and we are grateful for that. Across this nation this past summer, we saw marches in cities across this nation, as Shari has alluded to earlier, about Black Lives Matter and racial justice across our nation. I'll start with you, Dr. Christie. How are the marches then and the marches now that we saw last summer different or similar, if you will, and why are they important?
I think both marches are a cry for the respect of Black bodies. Both marches are a cry for self-expressions that we matter, that our voices matter. And what I really appreciate about both of the marches is that what some Blacks were not able to do, particularly in the 60s, in their communities of fear of reprisal, they were able to shout it in that covering in that large march together, because they had like believers. And maybe I just believe that some people found their voices in that marches, found the courage to say things that they weren't able to say before. And there's some healing in that when you're able to have some self-expression in that way. And I think the same is true now, that there was this pent up frustration for Black people about all of what was going on, about all the bodies that were dying just recklessly, like we didn't matter, right? That we were not made, as Shari said, in the image of God. And to be able to march and to say that loud, as the artist says, that I'm Black and I'm proud, and that I'm a human being and I want you to respect my humanity. And if I'm not human, you're not human. None of us are human, right? And so you respect your own self by respecting my own humanity. And so I appreciate that commonality between the two of them. The energy, wow. I love the fact that in this particular march, so many, as Rabbi said, from different cultures are coming together. You couldn't tell at some of these marches who really organized it, who started. And I give locally, I live in a suburb. We're one of the few Black families that are here during the Black Lives Matter movement. On the town hall, there was a call to show some support around Black Lives Matter. I was personally very surprised at the number of folks that showed up, white people that showed up with signs with their children holding up Black Lives Matter sign. It brought me to tears because I didn't expect to see that. And it was comforting on some level to know that I could have my voice there. Now, I probably would not have voiced myself the same way in that community on the green, but the energy of the gathering gave me some safety, some security to self-express in a way. And so I think that's important, that we're able to find some support amongst each other across races. This is why the alliance is so important. And it was so important back when Martin Luther King was doing it. Rabbi Heckscher would call for the rabbis to come on the front line in the march, right? So the Black bodies wouldn't be hosed down and shot down because they were valued. The white bodies were valued. And in some ways, it's the same now, that the alliance is important because we're better together than we are separate and apart.
Reverend Hyman, why don't you jump in on that question as well?
Well,
similarity
certainly.
and difference of the marches.
Yeah, the thing is that the March on Washington and the March to Selma, as opposed to the marches today, I agree with Reverend Christie that they were about people giving voice to themselves and knowing that others cared. But often people look at the marches in the early 60s as an opportunity for Black people to become free. But it wasn't just the freedom of African Americans that occurred in the marches of 1963 and 64 and 65. It actually freed all of America. It freed those of us who were born not free, as I was, and those who believed that they were free, but really were shackled to maintaining segregation and all of the other parts of it. Our nation is a lot better because of it. I grew up as Mother Blanche Sumter did. I'm not as old as she is, but I grew up in a segregated South, where it was the law that I could not come into a building or a store or to try on something in the downtown area. And so that the freedoms that we fought for together as Jews and as Blacks was very important during that time. I think that it is important to note that the freedoms that occurred then, the idea that people fought for those things at that time, are the same things that we're fighting for today. I have to admit, though, that as a young child, I had more hope in South Carolina when I knew that people were being killed and bombed and harmed, because I knew that people were fighting for justice and that we were out in the end. To have this happen now, during this time, some 50, 60 years later, you have to look for that hope, and that hope comes from all of us joining together. So the marches that have happened recently are certainly marches to claim that we too, that we are all men and women, and we deserve a right to live and thrive in this country. And so that's quintessentially American. We must continue to do that, even though it may seem like it is a hopeless situation. We know that hope is there if we continue to persevere.
Absolutely. I think it's important that we continue to come together, and our voices are heard best when they're joined together in chorus to talk about the inequalities that are happening in our nation. And so it is so important, and we can see what happened on Bloody Sunday and what's happening with Black Lives Matter movement and other marches for justice. We have another short clip, and after that, I'll come back with a couple more questions.
Hi, my name is Bob King. I'm a member of the Stamford NAACP, and my purpose this evening is to highlight the beginning of the NAACP and the connection to the Jewish community. Many of you may know what I'm going to say, but it's nothing better than refreshing ourselves with some of the things that we should have at the tip of our tongue, that we should be using for our families and our children and for our communities. And so I'd like to talk about how the NAACP originated in 1909. That's about 112 years ago. And the celebration was that there were the first president of the NAACP was Joel Spingarn. And Joel was a Jewish gentleman who was a professor at Columbia University, who had been part of the original group who had discussed the Niagara movement, which was about 4 years prior to the 1909 organization of the NAACP. And he was a very strong leader, believed in education, believed in people working together, and believed in civil rights, human rights, and socialization in the city of New York. And because of Mr. Spingarn, we have a medal that's given out every year that's in honor of his contribution to the NAACP, called the Spingarn Award. We give it to one of the leading African Americans at that time, who will be recognized by the NAACP for their contribution to civil rights, education, and social activities. And so many of our leaders in the African American community have received it. It's one of those awards that's next to, it's like a human rights award, and it is given for people who have made major contributions in our community. There's been movie stars, businessmen who have achieved quite a bit, who have been recognized. And Spingarn will always be a part of the NAACP experience. I share that with you because I want you to know that the NAACP and the Jewish community have worked together for many, many years. Our journeys are similar. I was sharing with some of my friends about World War II and the and how during World War II, the Tuskegee Airmen and what they did to help win that war, and how the African American soldiers were the ones that went into the camps and freed a lot of our Jewish brothers and sisters. And that still lives with each of us, even though we may not discuss it on the African American side, but on the Jewish community side, they know that we were there for them. And then when we move into the civil rights piece, well, they were there for us. They provided legal support. They provided money and finances. So we have a lot in common. And I think we have reached a point where we're losing the strength of what we had built or our ancestors had built for us. So I encourage us to continue moving forward and working together. And I'd like to share a personal story real quick. For instance, I grew up in a little town called Beacon, New York. And one of the things that I remember, my mother was a domestic and she worked for a lot of Jewish families. And I was sitting with her one day and I said, well, you know, you're always going to work. And there was 6 of us. And she says, son, look at what I'm doing. She says, I work for a doctor. I work for a dentist. I work for an optometrist. I work for the gentleman who has the drugstore. And he says, how do you think that you get all the treatments that you need if I wasn't working for those folks? He said, they care about me and they care about you. So I've carried that with me all my life. And as a deacon in my church, I've also studied the Old Testament. I've been in politics and I've worked with a lot of Jewish people. And it's my honor to be here, just trying to reinforce the partnership that we've always had and that we should look forward to continuing so that our children and our grandchildren will have an opportunity to be able to do what our ancestors started and be able to complete it. Thank you.
American Jewish Committee declared that Jews cannot ensure equality for themselves until and unless it is assured for all.
We thank Bob King for his insight of the NAACP and their work with the Jewish community, which is so important. I'm going to ask another question. We want to be conscious of time, so I'm going to ask you to be as brief as possible to our panelists, as we want to get some questions from our audience. It is good to see we have over 300 people watching us today and viewing with us today, and we are thankful for them being with us. And so we want to be mindful of their time. You heard Dr. King in that short clip just say, Jews cannot ensure equality for themselves unless and until it is ensured for all. I'm going to start with you, Rabbi Hammerman. Can you talk about why that's important and how we should understand that?
Absolutely. I think it is one of the most important messages of all of Scripture, love your neighbor as yourself, which despite all of our suffering, and I say this also for other communities who have suffered, one of the great tests is whether you turn that suffering inward into being an eternal victim. And that would have been so easy following the Holocaust and so easy following slavery. Or do you turn it around and embrace everyone else who is suffering, take that pain and turn it into a lesson on how we can strengthen human dignity? And I just want to make a point about what happened this summer, because I think it's really important. COVID happened. COVID not only left us in our homes so that we could watch every second, every minute of the indignity of George Floyd's death again and again and again, but COVID also reminded us of the fragility of life and of the importance of human dignity. and it was the last straw. We saw how, for some people, life is cheap. We saw, for some people, how our democracy is cheap, and we decided to take it seriously. So all the things that we've been talking about and spouting all these years, suddenly we began to march. Suddenly we wanted to talk. Our congregation wanted to have a dialogue. We wanted to learn. We wanted to understand the roots of racism. We want to understand how to become anti-racist. I was fascinated by, in the movie, about how Jim Crow affected Jews in ways that I didn't realize, in you know, no Jews and dogs being admitted into Southern Floridian hotels and restaurants. We've, of course, experienced lynchings with Leo Frank and others. So we share that suffering and we share the indignities, and now we can share the chance to stand up and fight for the dignity, not just of our groups, but of all of humanity. And this summer is when that began to happen.
Thank you. Reverend Hyman, I'm gonna go to you. Same question. As you think about that statement by Dr. King, how is that important in today, and how should we understand that?
Well, I think that Dr. King was prescient to the extent that here we sit today trying to figure out where do we go. I think that Reverend Hammerman is right, that the COVID crisis had a silver lining for us in our understandings, in our ability. I mentioned earlier that we look towards, not knowing it, towards opportunities that come our way. The silver lining, the things that happen, the fact that the war in 1945 ended and that there were Jews in this country who were empathetic towards what was happening to African Americans. The fact that President Kennedy, looking at 1963, 64, and deciding that the issue of racism in this country and freedom in this country was as old, as he said, as old as the scriptures and as clear as the Constitution. So he was trying to pull those things together so that America could see that here was our responsibility, that this was a moral issue, but it was also an issue that America could handle. And I think that's where we're at today, is that understanding that there is a moral issue for us as a nation to stand up for our brothers and one another, to do it together. If there's anything that we've learned, it's the idea that those coalitions matter. That's what mattered in Georgia, was a coalition of folks getting together and seeing that they were going to right a wrong. We're going to continue to need to do those types of things and to fight for that in a joyous way, to know that there is strength in our numbers and our beliefs, and that we're also going to be prepared as partners to reconcile in some ways to those things that have been the elephants in the room between Black and Jewish relationships. Because reconciliation is important, and the way to get there is through some type of acknowledgement that we can respectfully have a conversation about the issues that divide us, knowing that what we want to have is peace and harmony, but we cannot get there by ignoring that those things exist.
Thank you so very much. Shari, you told a wonderful story and shared legacies, and I believe you've opened dialogue with this story that is going to go on beyond today. And as you said, there's much more footage that will bring about more conversations. My question to you is, how should we listen to the stories and scars of each other?
The idea is that think about that there's still Holocaust survivors right now that literally have the scars imprinted in their arms, literally. So before these Holocaust survivors leave, they carry with them the physical scars. But what about their children, their grandchildren? Those scars are imprinted, so they understand the power of the human value of life. So we're here to be the allies of the Black community that has to lead in many ways, because I have 3 sons. When they go riding in their car, when a police officer goes to pull them over, I don't warn them that, God forbid, you better put your hand on the wheel be worried and afraid of that police officer, right? Well, Black mothers and fathers are still having this conversation. That is not okay. So therefore, when Rabbi Joshua Heschel in the 60s said, Martin Luther King is the gift to America, what did he mean by that? The Jewish people began the Exodus story. We understood that human life has value, and our communities, whether it's Purim, we kept, as I said before, having no value. But now it's the Black community that has to take this torch up to lead us to understand the power of human value. And we as Jews understand that it's ingrained in us. Especially since those Holocaust survivors are still here. So we have those, as Reverend Vivian said, who's no longer with us. Those transgenerational wounds, they're all in us, and let's use them to work together. Even if I don't have to warn my children like you have to warn your children, but we need to resolve this if we're going to all live in America together. And as you know, there's many Jews of color nowadays who are leading this conversation as well. But we have to work together because we understand at the basic level the intrinsic value of human life, and we have those scars imprinted in our souls. But we just have to wake them up. And how do we do it? Through studying the history, through talking, through getting to know each other, because we all have that spark of God on us. So once we talk, it's just obvious. It's just obvious that we all should be connected and having these conversations. Everybody has something to contribute to the value of making this world a more just world. All of us have something to say and something to contribute.
Thank you so very much. And Shari, thank you again for this great, great movie, and one that's going to be lasting. Dr. Christie, at the onset, we learned that you were the catalyst for bringing us all together. You saw this movie and decided that it was important that we would have this conversation. And I want to thank you for pushing us in this direction to have this conversation. So my final question before we go to questions from our audience today is this: how can we work together going forward?
Is that a question for the panelists? Or
that's for you, Dr. Christie.
Dr. Pogue, I think the first thing we need to do is to acknowledge what is before us, right? And you're talking about scars, and to acknowledge the scars. I think part of what prevents us from moving forward is the lack of acknowledging what has been, right? To not have acknowledged the injuries and the history is painful. And so I think part of the healing about going forward is for both of our communities to acknowledge that. And to acknowledge what is separated, what's been the wedge even to now. The elephant in the room is that we're not kumbaya like we used to be, right? There is a wedge there. And so we need to acknowledge that and to speak to that so we can transform what that is. And then we need to make space to get to know each other. I think Dr. King was the one that spoke about that we need to be comfortable sitting at each other's table and having conversation and being able to listen with a deep listening, without judgment and blaming and criticism, without pointing the finger, and just to hear the heart and the pain and the concern of the other person, without telling a story about, well, you could have and explain about how you did it. And so those simple things, I think, can make a difference. And so I'm very suspicious about those now that want to rush to do something without having that time together, without making space to hear each other and to hear the pain that's been there for all these years. And so to rush to do something, I don't think that's sustainable until you understand the history, until you really get in touch, like, wow, get in touch with my humanity. Like, I am really made in the image of God. I bleed red just like you bleed red. I have children trying to go to school. We feed them, all these other things that we share together. I think when that happens, we can really begin to plan something to move forward. And I think one of the things that I'm really proud of between Temple Bethel and AJC that we're doing is exactly that. Just listening to each other, listening to the pain without judging and pointing fingers and being empathetic about all of it, right? So that's where I think we start before we can move forward and have all these grandiose plans about doing things.
Thank you, Dr. Christie, and thank you to the panelists. It was an honor of mine to be able to moderate this question and answer session. Now we're going to get questions from our audience, and we want to thank you for being with us throughout this program.
Thank you all so much for these very powerful words and thoughts. We have many, many questions from the audience, and we could be here certainly for hours on end to be addressing those questions. So we'll ask you to please address them briefly. I do want to share one comment that we got from Representative Bob Lyon, who was on with us this evening, who mentioned that Mickey Schwimmer's mother and he worked together as teachers in New Rochelle about 5 years after Mickey Schwimmer's passing. And that is a moment that he wanted to share with us. And of course, that New Rochelle was the town brought to the Supreme Court, which outlawed de facto segregation in the North. So we wanted to share that with you all. Our first question that we received is from AJC National President Harriet Schleifer, who asks, what are some of the hurdles that our two communities have to conquer to add more people to this wonderful discussion? I would like to think that many on this Zoom call are already committed to social justice and the strengthening of our relationship together. But what and how do we overcome those hurdles? And if we can ask for brief responses so we can answer more questions.
Well, I will answer. We're doing work with Stamford Stands Against Racism, and it is a collaboration of people of various faiths, various economic levels, and ethnicities. And so that we're looking for individuals who are prepared to lean into both the conversation, but also for the planning that's necessary. It can't just be my voice or just the voices of a few, but we're looking for great ideas from a lot of other people as to how do we go forward together. And that's one place that if those of you who are out on this call are interested, to please contact us at Stamford Stands Against Racism. This is an effort to address systemic racism. It will have a benefit for all of us in our city.
If I may, just for a moment, I think we have to overcome a lot of the stereotypic knee-jerk responses that we might have. If you bring up issues that have become hot button issues, that have become elephants in the room, maybe we need to be able to explore together different approaches to these issues. And, I don't need to name too many of them, but I'm sure the Middle East would be one. I'm sure affirmative action would be another. I'm sure, redlining, whatever. But we need to be able to talk as if we're coming across these subjects for the first time. Also, we need the humility, and we need to be able to feel shame. I felt shame when I saw what happened in Minneapolis this summer. I felt shame like I've never felt before for my country, that this could happen here. And I felt shame that I hadn't done more, that my community hadn't done more. We need to be able to feel that shame, not necessarily to feel pain, but to understand that, we have some culpability, as Heschel said. In a free society, some are guilty, all are responsible. And finally, sort of turning it on its head, yes, there are scars. Yes, there are elephants in the room. But yes, there are people and forces, not just now, but since the beginning of American history and beyond, who have used divide and conquer as a strategy to drive our groups apart. We have to be able to recognize when that's happening. We've got to understand when people are using for whatever political purposes, blaming the other group, scapegoating, as a means of driving our groups apart so that we can overcome that and come closer together.
Thank you all. Another question that we have, which is related, is do you think that the biggest driver of hatred today is through social media? And if you all can briefly address that question, please.
I think social media contributes. Social media You know, when you go, when McDonald's first came out, they didn't have supersize, and then you could go and supersize it. I think it's McDonald's does that. And so social media kind of supersized things, the speed of information getting out to folks. But I think it was always there. I think the fabric of the kind of hate has always been in the country. People were just expressing themselves on social media, and they were forming communities amongst themselves to support each other to express that. And so I think that's my opinion on the role of social media in this. I think it might just expose what was already there, what was already present in the hearts of people.
Well, I would agree with Reverend Christie that it was always there. Historically, we can draw the thread, pull the thread back to the Civil War and beyond for this country with what we saw on January 6th, the Confederate flag and the rotunda, for example. So it was always there. However, I'm a believer in the fact that that there were certain things that many of us grew up on this call with the idea was that we should never even think certain thoughts. There were thoughts that once we thought them, that we should not have said them, and we knew that. And then there were other thoughts that once we said them, we should not do them. We have reached a crescendo in this country where people think things that should never have been thought. They say things that should never have been said. And now we're acting upon them. And I think that there are more people, because of the ability of social media to connect, who have been given the right or power to actualize themselves in some ways that are negative and hurtful for the nation. We must not be afraid to address that and to know that it's happening in our midst, that this is not just simply a small group of people anymore. There are others who are concerned, and there is a moral issue for us as a nation to deal with that threatens our very democracy.
Thank you all. We're going to hear now from AJC Regional President Stephanie Barrand, who is going to close out our program this evening.
Thank you to our partners, our co-sponsors, to our esteemed and brilliant panelists, and to each of you for joining us this evening. We are grateful to Mother Blanche Sumter, Bob King, and Rabbi Philip Schechter for sharing your powerful experiences with us all. Thank you to Shari Rogers for this extraordinary film, which brings history to life for each of us anew. The link to watch the film is available for free until tomorrow, Monday evening. This film cannot just be thought of as telling history. It is important for us to honor this partnership between the Black and Jewish communities every day. We are all committed to continuing this conversation and partnership and to the daily work that is required of standing together. When one community is under threat, every community is threatened. We honor Black History Month, we honor Black Jewish unity, and we look forward to continuing to stand strong together. Thank you and good night.
Right.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. Thank you to those of you who lent your stories to us and will continue to lend your stories in partnership as we continue to march together. Thank you all, and we look forward to joining together again very soon. Have a great evening.